Conversation with the Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo, professor of geography at Grand Rapids Community College. And today, we're very fortunate to have Timothy Beach, distinguished professor of geography at the University of Texas at Austin. Tim, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's a great pleasure to be with you, Mike. It's been fun to meet you before, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
This is wonderful. As I ask many people who are interviewed, I ask them to reflect upon their backgrounds, their childhood, experiences perhaps during adolescence or early adulthood, and also their undergraduate years and graduate years, and to consider what attracted you to geography.
Yeah, I always think that my career had three main acts to it and a prologue. And I always think of the prologue as the education and growing up and what you're interested in. And so I grew up in rural Northern California at the foot of Mount Lassen. I always tell people that I was born near Mount Lassen. And it's the one thing they can remember because there's nothing large enough for anybody to know from around that area. And so I grew up with an outdoorsy family that was always taking part in the outdoors, and from multiple generations of geologists and chemists and lots of scientists, but we grew up in ranch country. So my friends growing up were ranchers and orchardists and loggers and you name it. Those were very much primary industry located places in Northern California. But that all kind of drove me in the direction of wanting to do geography to combine the various interests that I had. I was always interested as well as in ecology. I was mindful of the fact that the Great Central Valley that I grew up on the edge of was at one time one of the largest wetlands in the world, but had been largely drained, 95% or so. And so this former Pantanal was a dry area growing walnuts and rice and a lot of other crops, leading the country and the world in a number of different crop production. So those things are always in my mind. And so I wanted to study things that had to do with those resource questions. And I was always motivated as well by humanities and literature. And so I studied at a small state college in Northern California at Chico State and got a fantastic education. My family had, again, come from other areas. They came from Minnesota initially and then moved to the Central Valley in the 1930s in the Depression and found jobs in San Francisco, and then family moved up into the valley after that. But they're always driven by finding places that had a good connection to rural places. So I went to Chico and had some great teachers. There's so many of them that I hesitate to say individuals because I don't want to leave anybody out along the way. I had a minor in English, for example, and in art history, and a lot of environmental science and geoscience and geography. And that was kind of always the expectation, was I would be more of a geoscientist just because the family had done that. But I was also so interested. I had a botany course. I remember thinking, wow, I don't know, maybe botany is the right next direction for me. But fortunately, there was biogeography, and there are all these areas within geography that could allow me to bring those together. And so that's kind of the background for that. And then reading a lot of literature on the great migrations of America into the Central Valley in the Dust Bowl years, and literature from around the world and translation. A lot of Japanese literature, for example, a lot of English literature, and had courses that I'm very proud of still as a geoscientist on Shakespeare and Chaucer and a lot of different Japanese literature over those years. So I got interested then to go to graduate school, and I still consider that as kind of the prologue, and went to graduate school and pursuing these fairly wide interests. I thought I might do something in environmental historical geography. And I got to graduate school and I found out the pull of geosciences was still really strong, as was ecology and biogeography, and ended up doing a master's more in the area of biogeography and water resources. I can talk about mentors now because I won't leave anybody out, but my advisor was a wonderful scholar by the name of Dwight Brown, who's passed away now. And Dwight was a great biogeographer, but he was across the board geographer. He'd started off in geomorphology as well. He was a physics guy as an undergrad. And he was like me from farm country. And so we had a lot to talk about. And that led to a master's mainly on the biogeography of the Great Plains and looking at Great Plains grasses and how they were distributed by climate. And that got me first started thinking about climate change early on at that time too. But I got interested after the master's by a number of my mentors. They included Phil Gersmail, a great education geographer and one of the great underrated.
Well, and a physical geographer. I mean, and his doctoral
I
dissertation was on the grassy balds.
Yeah, I think he's like one of the most widespread geographers ever. Education geographer. He recognized the importance of education geography in a very intense and thoughtful way. So I learned a huge amount from him. And he was at heart a soils geographer, really. And he had geomorphology in his background with all these other interests. And that drew me into soils and into geomorphology. And so I wanted to study, in that case, go from the Great Plains to the Great Plains and the upper Midwest and the areas where farmers had moved in. And they caused a tremendous amount of erosion. So it struck me as something that was practical and interesting to get at this question of why was there so much devastation by pretty, smart farmers who'd moved from Germany and Ireland and other places, but couldn't make sustainable agriculture in the upper Mississippi Valley. And so that's why I did a PhD on that. And I had a number of great advisors in this. John Borchert, who's perhaps the most famous of them.
Who also looked at climate on the Great Plains.
And believe me, I still teach his stuff, actually. I was just talking to a friend recently who is still teaching his stuff as well. This is 1940s and 50s research that still holds forth today as powerful work.
Yeah, it's such a strong presence, Borchert.
He was a remarkable man, as were these other folks I was mentioning. And I also had a number of geologists. H.E. Wright, Herb Wright was one of the greats of the field, and that brought me more into quaternary studies and looking at the long-term records of environmental change in the upper Mississippi Valley. And I have to say, I had these folks at Minnesota, which was a great place for this, but people from Wisconsin were also great mentors too. And I was so impressed that Jim Knox, who was this great physical geographer, but deeply thoughtful person in many different fields, was very happy to mentor me. We talked many times. He'd always give me advice. He never cut me off at any time, even though I was from a different university. And so I learned a tremendous amount from him. I learned a tremendous amount from a lot of other scholars along the way. And that came to a dissertation that was published in the Annals of the American Association of Geographers on erosion and sedimentation in smaller watersheds in the upper Mississippi Valley. And I remember just that I had to do historical archival work. I had to dig a lot of holes. I had to survey a lot of areas. I had to use rather preliminary GIS, but we used GIS to be able to quantify how much deposition and how much erosion was across these areas. And to me, that was the most fun because I got to do everything. I got to do the field work, the archival work, the lab work, and then come up with some findings that some people are still reading now. I'm very proud of that work as well. I know that a University of Minnesota geology seminar just was rereading this work and seeing what they could, how they could build on for more knowledge from this. Never gotten back there again because the next chapter, the next act was after going through some other jobs. I got a job at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, and I was asked to teach the environment. And that was a wonderful opportunity. And so I broke it into major areas of the environment and became the first person to teach geoscience, not geography, but geoscience and environmental science, and to start a program in the School of Foreign Service and a program called Science, Technology, International Affairs, and then later Environmental Studies program, which we started too. And that brought on a new chapter because before that I'd started working, I'd been asked to come down and work in Central America and bring the kind of research that I'd done before in the upper Mississippi Valley. And I have to say it was epiphany to come to the tropical rainforest for the first time and to see its bounty and its biodiversity and the lure of the fact that there are all these temples underneath these giant trees. And so this became the ultimate next part of the first question. The first question was human impacts on the upper Mississippi Valley. And the next part really became, Act 2 became human impacts in the Maya world that spread to other parts of the world too. And that was also to some degree a bit of luck along the way because I was told when I was a professor in the School of Foreign Service, it didn't matter where you studied as long as it was outside the United States. The idea was this was international affairs. You were supposed to be studying places. They didn't care what it was. Bring it back to Georgetown, and it'll make this place a better place because it's now talking about environmental change in Central America rather than just politics.
And that wasn't Minnesota.
This all, yeah, well, all of those things are in Minnesota too, of course.
But yeah.
Yeah, so that was kind of the second act. But go ahead, you had a question too there.
No, I was going to say Georgetown was not interested in research being conducted in Minnesota. They wanted to emphasize that foreign area research, and you had the opportunity to engage in it, in the Mayan world. Yeah,
in fact, and I was very happy to take that on. I loved the Upper Midwest. I loved my advisor who had helped me do this work, and the students who I worked with up there too. But I thought this work had not been done at all in these areas of the tropical world. And so we were taking this in many cases for maybe not the first time, but some of the early work on this stuff. We had great geographers, though, who were great mentors who led us into this work before, too. I remember there's this, you probably have interviewed Billy Lee Turner before, Jr., who's now a very famous professor at ASU and one of the great geographers of, the last 100 years. And Billy had been working in the Maya world before me, and I remember meeting him when he gave a talk at Minnesota, and I was so impressed with the guy, his energy and his mind and all the ideas he brought to it. I thought, well, it'd be wonderful to get into that area. A
fascinating geographer that I've not had the fortune of scheduling yet. How's that?
You better schedule him.
I should, yes.
The thing that I remember the most about him is just the level of energy he brought to everything and his intellectual just focus on things. As well as his wonderful Texas accent, which the chance be that somehow I ended up in Texas later on, and I hear a lot of them down here, but nothing quite like that. So that's kind of the second part then, was to teach at Georgetown for 20 years and start the environment programs and have so many amazing students that went on into every field imaginable. And I have to say, that would have been a great career in itself. And I would never have looked back if that had only been it, because I was able to follow around these students I had. I had them just through a Bachelor of Science degree, and then they went on to all sorts of walks of life. But I've stayed in touch with many of them since. So I will email dozens of them still as friends. And I consider them mentors now because they're in things like solar energy around the world and all sorts of different kinds of businesses and lawyers and environmental lawyers and so on. But the third act then came when we had the opportunity to come to Texas, and it was driven more as a pull factor because it was the opportunity to work with one of the other true greats of the field. And I still think underrated true great was Carl Butzer.
A giant.
One of the greatest geographers since Humboldt, and many people would say. And his family were refugees from Nazi Germany, and he was very much in support of refugees. He was also a wonderful scientist, first-class scientific mind, undergraduate degrees in mathematics and in climate, weather kinds of things, and then finally in kind of geography as applied to long-term human change, and that is from even early African related hominins. And environmental change to our current Homo sapiens sapiens.
One might say he's one of the very few Renaissance men of our discipline in recent years. Yeah. Recent meaning since the Second World War.
Yeah. I would agree with that. I mean, I think we all think of Carl Sauer before that and Carl Butzer after that. And I think there's still, for years, I wanted somebody who was better at these kind of things to write a real book that showed the impact of this person. But also he underscores what geography is, this desire to help diversity in a field, to help refugees, to study displaced people, to study these kind of things, but also with physical geography as well. And always this desire to look at long-term human impacts. There would be no Anthropocene if people like Carl Butzer hadn't come along to show these early human impacts and early Anthropocene questions. And so that became the third act. And the third act then was to open a lab that we've named the Butzer Labs, in this case, to do soils and geoarchaeology, but also to maintain his ideas of diversity, recognize that these are human endeavors as well. And this is a lot of humanistic thought has to go into this, as well as the testing that we do all the time for different soils with different kinds of tools and machines along the way. So that act has been one of advising a lot of graduate students. So that's from 2014 on, and I've been able to advise 6 to 8, depending on how you mark it, different PhDs who went on to similar kinds of work like this, who are all doing very well in different either academic fields or in starting their own companies or in state government, or in some as scientists, scholars within national parks. So that's been this whole new last part. And I think of this as kind of a setting then for whatever the fourth act in this play is. The third act so far is wonderful fun, and been able to work with these graduate students and have a whole new group of faculty and have a group of geoscientists and geographers around who can bring a lot more tools than we had in the wonderful Georgetown School of Foreign Service. So that's where we are now. And then this last part, I always think of, there's a famous geographer by the names of Reds Woolman, who was also a mentor early on in my career.
Johns Hopkins, yeah.
Johns Hopkins. And Reds was one of those people who was so giving of his time. Again, he didn't care if it was a graduate student in a different program. He would sit and he would mentor them. And I remember he said that graduate education, I see this as any kind of education or research you're doing, is like drilling a well to an artesian aquifer. You drill and you drill and you drill. But when you hit the artesian aquifer, that water comes up on its own and it spreads out all over the surface. And I remember that's always kind of been a motto for me, because you study one area can lead you into other areas. And so we focused a lot on wetlands in Central America, and that got me thinking about wetlands in the high Andes and Ecuador and Peru. And I just advised a PhD on ecosystem formation in these wetlands as the glaciers are retreating, to get back to my long-term interest in climate change, its impact on the environment, and potentially how we could rewild places to bring ecosystems back faster in this case too. And so that's been an exciting new area that I continue to work with her on. And she's moved on to a French institute now, where she's continuing her own work on this research.
Let me interject something really quickly, if you don't mind. I wasn't anticipating a comment about Reds, but I should mention something. That is this: you really developed a great metaphor for his style of leadership. He was quite the transformational leader, looking at developing relationships in a positive direction to win the long game, to make an impact, like drilling an artesian well and hitting water. I just thought I would mention that.
These things were flowing out of him all the time. He was a great human. Again, like Carl Butzer and like John Borchard and others, these people who were, had gone beyond themselves and were constantly trying to mentor everybody around them in the best way they could. I always think of him too. Another great story is that one of my colleagues here, David Eaton, is a political geographer, resources geographer, who got his PhD with Reds back at Hopkins. And I remember he told me that he barely knew the guy was a geomorphologist. He just thought he was a geographer, because he didn't really wear that on his shoulder at all. He just thought good research is good research, and I'll be happy to mentor you in it, whatever you do. And David Eaton, this colleague of ours here, who's in LBJ, the Lyndon Baines Johnson School of Public Affairs here, has had a wonderful career as well as one of the great geographers of our time too.
That's a wonderful story. So let's go to the Belize and the Yucatan and talk about some of your research. You were conducting research in the Midwest, more or less with regard to fluvial geomorphology, and you don't have fluvial geomorphology in the Yucatan, but you did comment on groundwater. Would you care to just share with us some of the more striking findings that you really learned.
Yeah, so the Midwestern research set me up extremely well for the Mayan research because it allowed me to understand these human impacts over 100 years, 150 years, and how their impacts on land use and resources had such long-term impacts. These were 1,000-year impacts. I mean, even though they were over 100 years or fewer, then these were things that would be set in the geological record that you could see for 10,000 years or more. Who knows how much longer than that, too. And so when I got to the Maya world, I was so impressed by the density of ancient structures and places. You go under canopy, and everywhere you went under canopy, and these were early days before there was LiDAR, before there's the imagery that allowed you to see under canopy, you found things. And we found artifacts everywhere, every hole we dug. And my focus is on soils and wetlands, so I'm always interested in seeing soil fertility and how that led to crop production and so forth, and what lines of evidence we could bring for that and dating that could date when that occurred. That it got me thinking that this was one of these examples of the really early Anthropocene, where there was a very anthropogenic, humanized landscape for thousands of years. And so we started working on that work through a lot of different ways. We worked on it through soils, through water management, through cropping types that they used, through all sorts of diversions, all sorts of different parts of Maya infrastructure. And it became kind of a thing where each year we would find enough money to study a different part of this region. And we were triangulating the whole region from the Yucatan to far south to Belize and Nicaragua, even down to Nicaragua, but Honduras certainly. And so that worked then, and there are some fluvial landscapes there. And that's a very interesting point you make, Mike, because mostly we think of Yucatan as an internally drained karst environment driven by aquifers and groundwater flow and cenotes that go down to this groundwater. But there are along the edge rivers, and these river systems are really important. And I've studied both of those. Early on, one of the studies was, I was driven to study Chinchic meal. And the reason why was that Chinchic meal was this still very indigenous Maya town with a giant Maya site next to it. But it didn't have all the big pyramids, but it had an incredible number of mounds. And this is in
northwestern Yucatan, just south of Mérida.
And a lot of people there mainly spoke Yucatec Mayan too. So, we were working Spanish, and the people who knew, which I don't know, or I know a few words, of course, of Yucatec Mayan, were working with local folks. But the question was, is there only a couple thousand people living around there, and they're having a hard time growing enough food for themselves on extremely thin soils. But there's a city there from 600 AD or CE, however you prefer, that had 50,000 people or so, and somehow they were feeding themselves. And so that became one of the great early conundrums of our work, was to figure out how you could feed 50,000 people there, and that led to a series of papers on that. And that was with a remarkable friend of mine named Bruce Dolan, who was a really great Maya archaeologist, but also very mindful of broader kind of questions. He loved some of the geographic traditions, like the risk and hazards research, and he read deeply within that. And so Gilbert White, he was always quoting Gilbert White all the time, and Borchert, for that matter, worked with Gilbert White just to a degree. And so I could see that geography was really important in archaeology, especially more than, not more than other people had, but I could see it through archaeologists who'd been reading deeply in it and wanted to make sure I was keeping up my end with that. But then one of the things I always got interested in was that there were multiple forms of agriculture, and we studied those dryland forms of agriculture that were up at Chinchic Meal in the Yucatan. But I was interested in these areas that had wetland fields, and partly because I'd met Billy Lee Turner early on and he'd worked on this, and partly because there was controversy about whether they were natural features or whether they were actually wetland fields. And so I thought, well, this is an very interesting topic. to try to figure this out and do it in a way that didn't stomp on anybody's feet. What we wanted to do was to do this in a diplomatic. I've been to School of Foreign Service. I believe in diplomacy, and so I wanted to make sure and come down and do a fair, balanced approach to studying these to see to what degree they are human-made fields versus natural features. And so we spent from about 2000 to the present studying wetland fields. And early on, it was macheteing a path out to one canal we saw when we flew over, and then excavating that for weeks and going out every day to this particular site. And that happened from about 2000 or so to about 2017. But in 2016, we realized that we needed to really see if there was a bigger footprint of these canal features. And so we got LiDAR in 2016 and 2017. We really started to analyze it. And we saw that the handful of canals were gigantic. They went on and on. We knew there was a square kilometer, but now we knew there was more like 15 square kilometers in this region. It may sound small, but it's one small watershed that had these 15 square kilometers of canal systems. And we'd done enough research on it for that area to put aside the idea that these were natural features. There's a natural component to everything on Earth. Anybody in the sciences and social sciences recognizes that. But these were largely managed by the ancient Maya to grow crops, to drain water, to provide enough water. And we had lots of evidence to prove this. And we could prove that this happened over at least something like 1,000 years, from about 2,000 years ago to about 1,000 years ago. And so we started seeing this footprint is much larger, and that began to allow us to see, well, how important is this wetland agriculture around not only the Maya lowlands, but South America, the world. And so we started upscaling the Maya lowlands, look at wetland agriculture around the world, which I'm working on a book now that looks at China, that looks at South America, looks at the Maya lowlands, looks at where people have used this kind of wetland farming for a lot of different reasons. One, simply because it's the first really intensive agriculture. It's the first green revolution, is what I would say in that case too. Because now we're growing multiple crops, polycultures, in a smaller amount of area. And it's clearly, we know that from China. And I think now with more research in the Maya lowlands, we're learning that from the Maya lowlands. And now with one article after another, we're seeing it from Amazonia too. And so that's led to then a number of forays to work with friends who are working on Amazonia especially. So we are going to be working with a group on Bolivia. And then, as I said before, I work with a group with one of my students who's working on highlands of Ecuador. Highlands of Ecuador, for example, from Quito over, he's had wetland fields everywhere. And so these are, again, this extremely large footprint. So what we're trying to do in that is to flesh out how important it is to sustainabilities, to sustaining cultures in the past, these large cultures. What are the other things they grew? We haven't found out yet. And so we have some cutting edge areas now. The first cutting edge area was the LiDAR. The second cutting edge area will be to go from kind of traditional paleoecological records that show us what's growing to now eDNA. So now our lab and several of the students are working on eDNA to find out what else are they growing? What are we missing by just having pollen and phytoliths and the kind of general microfossils for what they're growing in the past? So those are some of the big kind of things we're working on in Central America. And I answer back to the initial question I can answer the initial question that I had, are these natural or are these human-made features, and say that there are some that are natural features. A lot of those were adapted by indigenous peoples to grow crops as higher points and lower points in canals, and they simply adapted them. But others were made with north, south, east, west canals that go on and on and on and on. And so there was a huge amount of knowledge that went into the building of these things.
That's fascinating. And you've extrapolated your study, or your learning, I should say, from the land of the Maya to other parts of the world, as you've gone to China. And where else have you visited to conduct
I worked
this
with one
research?
student in China, but that's very brief work. The main part has really been this move. Well, the other main area I've worked in is the Mediterranean. It was also on geoarchaeology, and that was 15 years working in Turkey, which was an incredible place, and I would love to get back there and have lots of ties with that work. It was harder to do that work later on, but the payback was wonderful for having been able to work in that culture, learn a little Turkish, learn a lot about ancient Middle Eastern and Mediterranean cultures.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've since then been able to work in Italy, especially Sicily, on similar projects that we're still ramping up, and we may have graduate students who are going to be working more on that. We do have graduate students who will be working more on that too.
What about South Asia?
South Asia is, and I'm glad, Mike, you brought it up, because one of the natural areas for people working in the Maya lowlands to compare with is Angkor. So Southeast Asia and South Asia.
Mm-hmm.
And there's lots of evidence for incredible wetlands around Angkor, and there's been lots of LiDAR around Angkor.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did write an article with one of my colleagues about comparing Maya and Angkor, and that's something that, and that's just one part of multiple Southeast Asian cultural groups, not just Angkor alone, but many other city-states that have similar kinds of forms. In India, I haven't worked yet, but there's lots of evidence for wetland agriculture there too. Mm-hmm. And I've begun to talk with several Indian scholars, and that would be a fascinating area to build into as well. But I haven't been there
Sure.
yet. I'm hoping to get there.
Well, good for
That'll
you.
be Act 4, maybe. I don't know.
Act 4, perhaps, in India. Well, look, we just have about a minute to go here, and I'm going to ask you to think about what you've accomplished so far, where you've been, and to consider how you might guide a prospective geography undergraduate major or graduate student. What's words of advice? What words of wisdom might you have for one?
Well, I think that if I go back to Red's Woman,
Mm-hmm.
I really do think that is echoic for me. And he was actually citing, when he quoted that's a quotation from Isaiah Bowman, to go back even earlier in geography. So another one of these amazing geographers in the past. And I think it plays out really well. Now, with geography, it's a little different, but I still think drilling the well down, you're drilling it within whatever your field is, you're getting more and more expert at that. If it's GI science, or if it's soils, or if it's geomorphology or water chemistry, you're drilling and drilling and drilling in that. And I do see that once you hit that aquifer, you get deep enough into it, you get invitations, you get invited, you get opportunities to do these other things. And that opens up a whole new world to start drilling some more of these wells too. You've got the water over the surface, but allows you some latitude to work in other areas too. Some geographers in the past had said, geography PhD is a poaching license. I don't want to use that kind of phrase, because I think it sounds a little pretentious. But I do think that the more research you do, the more you're driven by it, the more you'll stay up at night just wondering about and not being able to wait till the next time you're in the field or in the lab to be able to study something.
Jim, I think that's a wonderful consideration that many undergraduates and graduate students should really ponder and take to heart. One is not going to conquer Rome in a day by any means. It does take that hard work and that deep drilling to get to an ultimate destination. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Mike. It's always good to talk.
Hey, really appreciate it. And now this concludes this episode of Conversation with a Geographer. Thank you.